Hello, welcome to our webinar today. So this is our webinar with Sara Matos for, as you can see, the introduction to ports. I will go through a few housekeeping notes and a little introduction. So this is being hosted by the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, WSET. We are the world's leading provider of wine, spirits and sake qualifications. Our courses are designed to inspire and empower anyone looking to develop their drinks knowledge, from beginners to experts and from enthusiasts to professionals, with 4 progressive levels of study offered through an extensive network of course providers in more than 70 countries and translated into multiple languages. So WSET qualifications are globally recognised as the international standard in wine, spirits and sake knowledge. So just to let you know that this webinar today will be recorded. It will be available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. If you could post any questions that you have into the Q&A box, and we will try to cover as many of them at the end as possible. So my name is Lauren Denyer. I'm here today to assist with this webinar with Sara and answer and help direct her to some of your questions that you might have at the end for WSET Global. So I will hand you over to our educator doing this fantastic bite-sized session for us today. So this is Sara Matos, who is an educator with her own school, the Wine House in Portugal.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So I will just briefly introduce me. I'm Portuguese, so I live in Portugal. At the moment at the Wine House, we're an APP, we're an approved program provider for level 1 and level 2 in wines for WSET, proudly. And I'm also a certified port educator. So today my job is to share my love for port with you. So hopefully you'll be in love with port by the end of the session if you're not yet. So to do that, what we're going to discuss is what is port. So we're going to find a definition for port wine and how is port made. What we do in the vineyard and what we do in the winery will determine the styles, the different styles of wine of port we have. So we'll see, we'll have 4 styles of port, and inside it, each one of these styles will have different categories. Some you'll know, some are more obscure, and so you'll probably hear for them for the first time. We'll also go through history a little bit, port history and Portugal history, and some international history too. We're going to talk about England too, because it's the story of port is connected. History of port is connected with England too. And then we're going to finish happy handing with some classic recommendations regarding pairing port with food. So let's start. How is port wine produced? The first thing we need to make port is, of course, grapes, everything we need to have to make wine. The thing is that we can use white grapes or black grapes. The common thing between them, they all have to be harvested by hand, because as I'm going to show you, all the vineyards are in mountains, so it's pretty much impossible or very hard to harvest by machine and do any work by machine. So the grapes will be picked by hand. After that, we're going to make some grape juice. So we're going to crush them. Traditionally, only foot treading was using, so human foot would crush the grapes. But nowadays there are some machine pedals that imitate this gentle way of crushing the grapes. So at the moment we're having grape juice. We're going to have our must. But to be wine, the must has to ferment. So the yeasts, which are microorganisms that exists in the grapes, or that can be added to the musts, they're going to eat the sugar of the grapes and they're going to transform it into alcohol. We can use the skins or not the skins in this process. So if you're using black grapes, you're going to use the skins because the skins have color and we want that. If you're using white grapes, you can use with or without the skins. So the yeasts will eat this sugar and transform it into alcohol. And so for a couple of days, the yeasts are happily eating the sugar, but we're gonna end this party. So because we're gonna add a spirit that we call in Portuguese aguardente, which is literally burning water, which is wine distilled until 77% of alcohol by volume. So this process of adding the spirit is called fortification. Fortification comes from the word fort, which means strong. So the wine will be strong, it will kill the party of the yeasts, and there won't be anyone to transform the sugar into alcohol. So port will be sweet because we're adding the aguardente during the fermentation. But the most important thing about port and what will determine heavily the styles of port we're going to have is maturation, and mainly maturation, but also blending, which is a very important characteristic of making port wines. Generally speaking, if you can use bigger vats, bigger vessels, or smaller vessels. You can use stainless steel or you can use oak, as we're going to see, depending on the style. If you use bigger deposits, it will have less contact of the wine with the oxygen, which means the wine will be more red. So we're talking about the ruby styles that we'll discuss in a while. And you'll have more fruity character, red fruit, black fruit, chocolate. If you use smaller vessels, we're going to have more contact with oxygen. So the wine will have a more tawny, a more brown color, and will have more dried fruit aromas and flavors. And blending is pretty much all about port. I don't know any port that is monovarietal. So blending is all about blending grapes, blending vintages, blending vineyards, blending techniques. It's a very important thing about a port. So to show you how can you do this about maturation, about blending, let's see where do the grapes come from. To make port wine, all the grapes have to come from the Douro Valley. The Douro Valley is a wine region demarcated in Portugal. Like to make champagne, you can only use grapes from Champagne region in France. To make port wine, you can only use grapes from the Douro Valley. So the Douro Valley is this red region that you see here. So Portugal borders with Spain on east and north, and Atlantic Ocean on west and south. So the name of the region Douro comes from the Douro River, which is born in Spain and then crosses the Douro and disembogues in the Atlantic Ocean. So zooming in to the red Douro region that you're seeing in this map, we have here the Douro, and we see the river crossing the region and disemboguing in Atlantic Ocean. And why is the wine called port if it's made in the Douro? Because in the old days, the wine would go through the river until the Porto city, so it's the name of the city there, and will be shipped to the world in the boats. Sorry. And so that's why it took the name of the city. So Porto and Gaia are very important places regarding aging and blending. Imagine if there are some producers, the oldest producers, they have lodges in the Gaia area, and they also have wineries in the Douro. The youngest producers, they don't have lodges in Gaia. So aging a wine in the Douro Valley, which is a more, as you can see, or you can imagine, a much warmer and drier area, the oxidation process will be faster. If you're closer to the ocean, there's more humidity, there's cooler temperature, so the oxidation process will be slower. So there's this aromatic descriptor associated with wines that age in the Douro Valley, but that doesn't happen in the regions close to the sea, which is what we call torradinho do Douro, which would be like roughly translated like Douro's toastiness. So this is a descriptor that you only find in wines that age in the Douro and not in near the ocean. So blending also depends not only from the vat, but the place where the vats are actually. And blending, look, we have three subregions. Douro Superior closer to Spain, it's warmer and drier. And you have Baixo Corgo, which means down Corgo. Corgo is the name of a river that comes from the Douro, so it's a river. It's wetter and humid. And Cima Corgo, Upper Corgo, is the region where there are better qualified vineyards to make port. So imagine you can blend also vineyards. These different places you can blend varieties, you can blend places, and you can blend vintages. Okay, so that's pretty much. What is the landscape? What are we talking about? I told you we're talking about vineyards in the mountain. So in the old days, the landscape was pretty much what we call socalcos. Socalcos means stairs, but sustained by stone walls. This is expensive to build, expensive to maintain. So it's not used anymore, but there are still very old vineyards we have built in socalcos. And as Douro is since 2001 UNESCO World Heritage Site, if the walls are destroyed, they have to be rebuilt. So it's very expensive to maintain. But if you see this one, you know these are older vineyards. More recently, in 1947, the first vinho alto was planted. Vinho alto means everything is planted with vertical lines. You can make more advantages of every bit of land to plant vineyards. So if you have more vineyards, you have more grapes. But you can't do this if the inclination is superior to 35%. Otherwise, it'll be too vertical and too hard to work with. The most common vineyards are the patamares. So again, we're talking about stairs, but carved in the mountains. They don't have stone walls. So this is cheaper to build and to maintain, and is the most common way to plant the vineyards nowadays. In this picture, you see there's one row. Some vineyards still have 2 rows. What happened is that we noticed that the row in the back was not open to sun, so it was more sensitive to fungal diseases and to problems. So pretty much everything is planted just with 1 row. So this is the more common nowadays. So what is port? What is our definition of port? The port wine is always sweet. I mentioned when we discussed about how port is made. The fortification process is made during fermentation when there's still sugar. So the sugar you have in port is the natural sugar of the grape that did not ferment. Okay, so the wine is fortified with the aguardente. So as it's fortified, we're going to have high alcohol by volume. We're talking about between 19 to 22. But as this is a very nice thing about port and about Douro region. This is a very traditional region, but it's also a very modern region, very paying attention to modern tendencies and modern preferences. And so there's a new style of port a couple of years ago that showed up, which is called light white port. It has a minimum of 16.5. So there are already ports with less alcohol, with medium alcohol. It's a wine because it ferments. In Portugal, we have a drink called jerupiga, which is pretty much grape juice that you add aguardente. So in this case, jerupiga is not wine because it didn't ferment. Port, it ferments for a few days, but it ferments, so it's wine. All the grapes have to come from Douro. That's mandatory. And Douro is in Portugal. According to what you do in the vineyard, in the winery, you can have different styles of wine, different styles of port. And what are these different styles? We can talk about 4 different styles of port. Remember, one of the first things that I told you is that we can use white grapes or black grapes. If you use white grapes, you can make the style white port. If you use black grapes, you can make tawny, you can make ruby, and you can make rosé. Okay. So if you take your black grapes to make tawny, you're going to use, as we mentioned before, you're going to use the smaller vessels, because you're going to have intentionally oxidized style of wine that will have a more brown color, a tawny color. So inside the style tawny, you'll have different categories. The first is the tawny, and it has no more than 3 years of aging. Then we have the reserva, which has a minimum of 6 years of aging. And then we have the tawnies with indication of age, which is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And more recently, we also have 50 years and more than 80 years. Again, the region is very sensitive to market demands and market preferences. And there is a bigger demand for older categories. So that's why these 50 and plus than 80 showed up recently. So what does this mean? Tawny with indication of age. It means that the wines are a blend. Remember, port is all about blend. It's a blend of different vintages with an average age of, for instance, 10 years old, but it also has to correspond to a style. So having the average age is not enough. You have to correspond the style that is defined to be a 10-year-old tawny or a 20-year-old tawny, okay? Then we'll have the colheita. Colheita is just from 1 year, okay? It has to be bottled a minimum 7 years. It has to age for a minimum of 7 years, but sometimes age is much more than that. And then we have a very uncommon style, very associated to just one producer, which is the Garrafeira. Garrafeira usually ages for 7 years in oak, and then 8 years in demijohn bottles, which are big glass bottles, about 10 liters bottle. But as a matter of fact, this week I just had a Garrafeira 1972, so it's very common to be much more than 8 years old. This is the minimum. Okay, so the style of wine we have in Tawny: brown color, dried fruit aromas like hazelnuts, walnuts, and cinnamon. This is very typical from the Tawny styles. And then, of course, depends on the concentration and the capacity of aging of all these different styles, because we're talking about more entry, low quality Tawny, and we'll have more higher quality as we go upper in the list. Regarding Ruby style, so inside the Ruby style, we can have Ruby, which is the same as Tawny, so no more than 3 years of aging. Then we'll have Reserva, the same as Tawny, so minimum of 6 years of aging. And then we'll have two wines, LBV and vintage, that are just from 1 year. So LBV means late bottled vintage. So the wine will be bottled 5 to 7 years after the harvest. And vintage 2 to 3 years after the harvest. So vintage is a very powerful, concentrated wine that if you want to invest in wine, it's a good category to invest, because it ages for a long time. So you can have younger vintages and older vintages, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about pairings. And then there's a more obscure category, which is called crusted, which is a mix of vintages, but as the wine is not filtrated, it develops a crust inside the bottle, and that's why the name crusted. Rosé is the youngest baby, so it was just created. This style was created again. Douro, very open to tendencies. The style rosé was created in 2008. Is usually vinified in stainless steel, because the idea is to preserve the primary fruit. So we'll have strawberries, we're going to have cherries, orange. So the idea is to preserve this fruit character. So that's why stainless steel is used. And it's pretty much for immediate consumption. And it's very nice in cocktails. So rosé and even white, they're pretty much used in cocktails nowadays. So white follows the same categories as Tawny. Sorry. The only thing about white is that usually in the label indicates the level of sugar. So the level of sugar goes between extra dry, which will be minimum 17.5 grams per liter of sugar, until very sweet, which will be more than 130 grams of sugar per liter. So the white is the only style that usually will indicate the level of sugar. So a little bit about history, because port has not always been about a sweet fortified wine. So I'll probably go to 1703, when the Methuen Treaty was signed between Portugal and England. And what was signed was that the Portuguese wines would be sold at lower tax, would have lower taxes when they entered England. So this led to people making port using wines from other regions, using other things that not grapes. So this led to frauds, and that in turn led to the need to demarcate and regulate the area where the grapes to make port were coming from. And so this happened in 1756, 1756. So Douro is considered the first region in the world to be demarcated and regulated. There were other regions that were already demarcated, so physically limited, but it didn't have rules. So Douro is the first region to be considered to be demarcated and regulated, so 1756. These stones you see here, so this is not an original stone. I have one here. This is not original because the stones were bigger than me. Well, you don't know how tall I am, right? But they're more than 1.70 meters. So there were big stones, but like these, like granite blocks that had the word feitoria, and they had the year they were put on place. So the first 201 stones were put 2 years after the demarcation in 1758. And the 130 something were put afterwards, 3 years later. So this block of granites were put it in place to demark the area. And they had the word feitoria because the wines that were made inside the stones, inside the demarcation, they were called feitoria wines. And these were the best wines, the ones that we could export and send to England. The wines that were outside the stones were considered the low quality wines. They were called the ramo wines. They were the ones that would stay in Portugal. So we would send the good stuff to England. It would stay with the lower quality stuff. So this is about bordering, lining the borders. About fortification, and I told you was one of the first things I told you with this slide. Port has not always been sweet. Fortification was common, but it was made at the end of fermentation. At the end of fermentation and before the wine was shipped, it was a way to preserve the wines during the long trips they would be making through with the ships, so the long journeys inside the ships. So the wine was fortified after the fermentation. It was not until 1850s that the fortification during the fermentation became universally accepted inside the region and the producers. There is inclusively one very famous person called Forester Baron, I think the word is Baron in English, Baron de Forester, was against fortification, was one of the first persons to draw a Douro map. And he died in the Douro Valley because, as you remember when you saw the subregions, Douro Superior was not an original part of the demarcation. So the Douro Superior, so the subregion closer to Spain, only became part of the Douro when they were able to take a huge rock of granite that was in the way to make circulation of the boats easier. So the Forester Baron died in this accident in the Douro River because of this huge stone. Because apparently he had some stones on his boots and it drowned. The ladies, because they had huge, I'll just say like huge structures holding the skirts, they would float and they arrived to the bank, so they survived. Okay, so this is pretty much a little bit about history. In the case of this picture, so this stone, there was an original stone here, but it was lost. So nowadays, I don't think we have more. I think we have less than 100 stones from the original ones. So this producer wanted to make a prettier one. So compare, this is just a single block. He wanted to make a prettier thing, but this is not original one. It's in the original place, but it's not an original one. So about pairings, I always like to do a bit of a disclaimer before talking about pairings. And this is something that WSET does in level 1 and level 2, and that it's very fun from my heart, because I truly believe that's how things should be happening regarding pairings. Pairings are not about impositions, are about recommendations. I don't eat meat, so no one's going to force me to have any kind of wine with meat. So I'm going to have with everything I want. So don't eat anything you don't like. So try. Pretty much everything will work well with most of the things. So this is just classic pairings that we do here in Portugal. So I'm going to share with you. So this is the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer about pairings is that I want to show you that port is not only about celebrations. Well, unless you celebrate life every day, and then you can use it for a celebration. But it's not just about birthday parties, or that's more than that. You can have port all year round and during all the meals. So before the meal, this is very typical, the roasted almonds, but also the green olives, the dates, and smoked salmon. We can have with a port tonic. So port tonic is a cocktail drink that nowadays is being canned by some producers. So it's pretty much a tonic water with the white ports. Each one of them has their own recipe. So you can try the port tonic in can with one of the recommendations before the meal. During the meal, you can have a white port with creamy soup. Trust me, I liked it a lot. LBV, you can have it with roasted meat, roasted fish, roasted vegetables. Then at the end of the meal, I have a lot of ideas to the end of the meal. You can have a Tony 10 years old with an almond pie. You can have a Ruby Reserva with some cheese or with some strawberry cheesecake. And you can have with a chocolate mousse, you can have a young vintage. After the meal, you can have what we call meditation wines. So you can have a colheita from the year of your birth, or of someone's special for you's birth date, and you can pair it with friends. So these are just ideas. So let me know if they work for you. So I hope I accomplished my mission to make you fall in love with port today. So Lauren, let me know if there are any questions, anything that need to be answered now.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was brilliant. So as an educator myself, I learned an awful lot in that session, and there have been a lot of questions, some great questions as well. So yes, thanks to everyone for their superb questions. So first one, once you open the bottle, how long can port last, and does it need to be refrigerated?
Well, that's a very good question. If it was my father to answer to that, my father would tell you it can last months, because he always has a bottle port in his basement. It depends on the style. There are some styles that last longer. So Tony is a style that is already oxidized during the winemaking process. So it won't last longer, but you can have it for weeks. You can put the cork back, because usually the Tony styles have how'd you say, like a bar top,
a stopper. I think we
a stopper, so it's not a cork. It says, so you can use that and put in the fridge. I pretty much have all my wines for daily day in fridge, so you can have it for weeks if there's not much air inside the bottle, of course, but you can put it in the fridge and it can last for weeks.
Brilliant. Just remember, if you have got any further questions, please put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat area. We've got quite a few to get through. So one from Bruno, is there usually any maturation after blending?
If there's any maturation after blending, it can be. So usually blending is the last thing to do before bottling. I don't know if he's asking about during the process. Yeah, usually blending is the last thing to do. Yeah, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. And one from Janet, why is white the only one to have sugar content stated on the bottle?
Oh my God, that's such a very good question. Like things we never thought about. I would say first, because it's determined by the legislation that's supposed to be like this, but there's not mandatory. White can it's not mandatory that you have the sugar. It's just a practical a common practice to use the sugar, but I don't think there's a direct answer to that. I'm sorry, I don't think there is any direct answer for that. Not that I occur now. Do you think of anything, Lauren, if there is any?
I suppose it's up to the producer, isn't it, whether they state the amount of sugar. I don't think most producers probably want to put too much about the amount of sugar, because some people are maybe a bit conscious about sugar levels in things. Yeah, but
although I always like to say, it's although it's natural sugar, it's like nutritionists sometimes they tell, oh, you can eat orange juice because it's sugar. Okay, but it's natural sugar. I think it's more about the combination of sugar and alcohol, which is obviously something you have to moderate yourself when you're having it.
Yeah. So I've got a few more to go. Another one from Bruno. Could you comment on the fact that that entry-level Tawny and Ruby are very similar?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I can tell you that I did my mock exam for a diploma, and I called Ruby Reserva to a Tawny years old because the color was very similar. So it depends on the blend. Yeah, that happens. Yes, it's true.
Great. And why, so this is an interesting one. Why the English got the best wine? So why the English got the best wine originally? And was there any sort of discrimination against the Portuguese, I think?
No, I think it's a very Portuguese thing to I think we're still developing that. So we have to trust in ourselves and give ourselves the best thing. So, oh, it's good to have a treaty with England. So we're gonna ship the good things. I think it's a very cultural thing to give the others the better things. So it's not a surprise for me that happened, but I think things are changing. So maybe we can share the good things between the two countries, not do all the good and leave the better, not the better for us. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of those people in history, thank you very much. Janet, will you be mentioning a few of the cocktails now being made with the rosé and whites? So I found that very interesting.
Yeah, so I mentioned about the port tonic in can. So nowadays you can buy the port tonic, the white port tonic in can, and then you can add I'll just say like an orange zest,
like
orange peel, and some mint. So it depends. There's a lot of recipes about port tonic, but you can already buy the port tonic made. And for rosé, also the same. You can always have some I don't remember the name, because I actually went to Imbibe this year to do a presentation on cocktails with the white and port, because are the more common to make cocktails. But there are huge recipes if you want to try, and they're very simple to do at home. Otherwise, try the port tonics in can. So they're certified DOC Porto.
Am I right in thinking you could swap out like a higher alcohol spirit for port? So it doesn't have to be gin and tonic. It could be a martini, for example, or just where you've got gin or maybe another spirit, you could use white port instead.
Buy rosé, buy white port, and it's very easy. And you can find a lot of recipes and some very good mixologists, port mixologists, very nice videos, well made. So you can find a lot of recipes in the internet. Yeah.
Great. So another question, how would you summarize the aroma and flavor profile for white port?
So it's more dried apricot, more honey, more orange peel. So this will pretty much, you're right. That's the only one I didn't mention, the aromatic profile. So that's pretty much it. Yeah.
And I've got one in Portuguese, I think. So let's, or maybe Spanish. Sara, sendo uma bebida dulce com comida?
Sendo uma bebida doce.
Com comida, with food, I think because you said something about a sweet drink with food. I think that's maybe a question around that. It's not in English, so I'm struggling with it a little bit.
Can I see it? Is it available?
Yeah, if you go into the Q&A area, it's the top, should be the top question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question properly, because well, I did some recommendations. Port is always sweet, as I mentioned, so I did a lot of recommendations to have with food. So you can have with soup, with creamy soup, a white port, and you can have some roasted meat. And if you're not a meat lover like me, you can have roasted fish or roasted vegetables. They can be very good with an LBV, for instance, which is a very nice style of wine to have a very nice price to have
I suspect the issue here might be that we often say with food and wine pairing that to have a sweet food with a dry wine is difficult, but actually you can have a sweet wine with savory foods, can't you?
Yeah, I think that's not the problem. What works is that the wine should always be sweeter than the food. So in this case, all the recommendations I gave, the wine is always sweeter than the food, so can work.
Cool. Thank you. So Maria's saying, I wonder if there's still producers making port the old style where there's fortification after the fermentation.
No, all port is sweet.
Okay.
All port is sweet.
Reserva Ruby and Reserva Tawny, the only difference is small barrels for Tawny getting the oxidation style as aging is for both 6 years.
Sorry, I didn't understand the
question. I think so. It's kind of a statement in a question. So Reserva Ruby and Reserva Tawny, the only difference is that you have small barrels for the Tawny, as both are aged for 6 years.
Generally speaking, because you always have the house, the style, I'll just say the style of the house. So it's yeah. So generally speaking, it's about the entrance of oxygen in one or the other.
And this would link, I think, the next question actually, because it says, is the same base or starter wine used to make Tawnies and Rubies?
It can be. It can be, yes. Remember when I showed you the first how port is made, pretty much until fortification, the wines are the same. So what makes them different will be aging and blending.
Remember, please put your questions in the Q&A area. We've got a few more. Is the port, we're getting more and more, everyone's very curious. I think it's such a vast topic, isn't it?
Yes.
Is port kept in the lagar for fermentation after treading?
Is port what?
Kept in the lagar for fermentation after treading.
So after trading, what happens after the days, then you drain the juice from the lagar, you add the spirit, usually in a proportion of one part of aguardiente to 4 parts of wine, but it's already outside the lagar that this happens, okay? And then we'll go to the vessels.
After the extraction, it gets removed.
Yes. So the open vats are good because we want rapid extraction in a short amount of time. So we need open lagars to do that.
Right. No. So, question from Aliona: does it need to be chilled before serving?
Yeah, that's a level 1 and level 2 in wines WSET question, exactly. So it's a fortified wine. It has high alcohol, high sugar. So yes, it has to be served it has to be put in the fridge. You don't. About temperatures, I always say that it's better you have the wine cooler when it goes to the table than having it warmer, because it will be harder to cool it when it's at the table. So put it in the fridge. Put it in the fridge if you're going to consume it immediately, because if you're talking about a vintage to store, put it in the fridge is not a good idea because the color precipitate. So it's not a good thing. So if it's for immediate consumption, put it in the fridge. No problem. Unless it's London now, it's 2 degrees negative or something.
You just put it outside.
Yeah.
So is there a law that protects port that produces, so basically, can you make port outside of port, or is there anywhere in the world that can make port?
I think there are 2 places in the world. I'm not sure about the countries now, because I'm not going to say it, but I think there are 2 countries in the world where the brand port was not registered. And so they can use the word port. I inclusively remember a few years ago a South African wine, as they couldn't use the word port, they called the wine USB port. So they would overcome this. But for instance, Tony and Ruby are not registered brands. Only port is.
Ah, okay. And when did port wines originate? So I think when
the first record is from the 17th century, so I think 1648. So it's the first time that appears in a book about selling wine to how do you call it today, País Baixo, Holland. So I think it's the first record. It's 17th century.
Okay, thank you. What grapes are typically used to make port?
Okay, indigenous grape varieties. So Portugal has this huge heritage with 250 indigenous grape varieties. So what port uses is typical Portuguese grape varieties. I can say some names, which usually are hard names to say. So we're talking about Touriga Nacional, we're talking about Touriga Franca, Tinta Amarela, Tinto Cão, Sozão. So these are all indigenous grape varieties, very typical from the Douro Valley.
Brilliant. Is foot treading still the most common method, or do auto vinifiers or even piston plungers, robotic lagars more commonly used nowadays?
Now they are more commonly used, of course, but there are still some places that use it for showing the tradition. It's but there's still some places that do, but it's not most common, the foot treading, of course.
Okay, and so
brands, of course.
There's only a couple more questions now. We're nearly there. Does most of the aguardente come from South Africa still?
Well, the law doesn't say that aguardente has to be Portuguese, so actually it can come from all over the world, but the aguardente is certified. So the aguardente has to be certified by the same entity that certifies port wine, and it has to be more neutral as possible. So it can be from all over the world, yes.
Are there still the use of lagars by humans in production, or today is everything by is it done mechanically?
Still used by foot for some higher quality, for some low smaller brands and all that. Yes, it's still used.
How old is the oldest bottle of port that you know of, Sara?
Well, Madeira would be easier because Madeira was 18th century. So port, I think the oldest would be beginning of the century, 19, I don't recall now the year exactly, but very, very old. So more than 100 years old port. Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions I'm going to put together. So how many different varieties can be used in port production, sort of overall? And then what are the white grape varieties that are used?
Okay, I don't know the number of varieties I don't know the words. So
On the top, by the top of your head, yeah.
Yeah, on top of my head, but they're classified as very good and good. So they're divided in some categories that as recommended web varieties. So there are a few, there are some, they're not few, there are a lot. And for whites, you can have Viuzinho, Rabigato, Goveio. So there are a few of the whites that I'm top of my head now. Yeah, but there are a few, and they're divided as very good and good.
Okay. And last question, apart from in Portugal, where in the world is most port drunk?
Where is, other than Portugal?
Yeah.
France, UK. So yeah, Europe.
Great. So thank you so much, Sara, and for everyone who is watching. And we're going to have a feedback poll appearing in a moment. And if you would participate in that, that'd be fantastic. And just to let you know that this recording of this session will be emailed to everybody. It will also be available on the WSET Events Hub on YouTube. And there's lots of other previous events you can watch there too. And if you want to find out more, sign up for our wine qualifications. You can visit our Where to Study page at wsetglobal.com. So thank you, everyone.